And we are live. Thank you for tuning in today. My name is LZRS. I am a venture-backed founder and engineer. I work in the crypto space and I make daily content Monday through Friday, reacting to various videos around the web. If you like this type of thing, please subscribe. I have lots of content. It's really good. We cover tech, we cover politics, and we cover the overlap between tech and politics. And today we're going to react to Mike Benz, who just came back on Joe Rogan's podcast. He had a prior episode. It was a gem. It was chock full of great information. We've talked about Mike Benz's work a lot here on this channel. And now we are going to react to his latest appearance. And in case you don't know, Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency has been working under Trump to cut back the waste, fraud, and abuse that is in an agency called USAID, and also in other agencies as well. And Mike Benz is one of the leading experts in documenting this corruption. And what's cool is he was able to deduce a lot of what they were doing prior to the audit having taken place. And now that a lot of this information is coming to light from Elon's activity, it completely reinforces what Mike Benz has been saying for years. So Mike Benz is an extremely smart guy. He's one of the most informed people in terms of actually having sources to back up his claims. And we're going to see exactly what he has to say in this episode. So let's start watching. And also, if you want to find this episode, I have a playlist on my channel called Sources. So I will add this to the Sources playlist so that you can easily find it on my channel. All right, let's get started.
Weaponization of what are supposed to be foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks operations against domestic opponents.
Hold on. It's a little bit ahead. Here we go. Let's start here.
Joe Rogan Podcast, check it out.
The Joe Rogan Experience.
Train by day, Joe Rogan Podcast by night, all day.
Mike, good to see you.
Great to see you,
I've been
Joe.
looking forward to this one.
Me too.
I've been all night I was like, ooh, tomorrow's going to be a good one.
Yes.
For you, it must have been very exciting to have the vault opened and to get a peek into the machine, because you've been describing this. The last time you were on the podcast, you went into depth about USAID. And it's very curious why they chose USAID as the first organization for Doge to investigate, because it seems like they were the ones that resisted the most.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you know, the joke that I tell here is it's like what they tell you to do your first day of prison is you go in, you walk up to the meanest, baddest SOB, and you punch him right in the mouth. I mean, that's basically what's happened here with the White House's first target being USAID, because USAID opens up the entire world of the blob, the foreign policy establishment, and its weaponization of what are supposed to be foreign-facing Department of Dirty Tricks operations against domestic opponents.
And when it all got opened and you started to see the numbers and the different organizations and NGOs that were getting them, was anything surprising to you, or was this all what you expected?
No. In fact, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg, and what people are going to see on this is going to completely reorient their mental map of how they think the world works, how they think American power projects into the institutions. And I think the calls for reform are going to get louder and louder as people realize the reality that's been constructed around them is downstream of something that was started very long ago.
So what he's saying is that what is still has not come out yet is going to be even more of a bombshell than what has already come out. And so I'm trying to think about how he could say this, because on some level, what's come out has already been very shocking. I think what he's getting at, though, is that a lot of the way that this has been framed is in terms of waste, fraud, and abuse, specifically waste. So we see that USAID is funding, for example, transgender dance festivals in some foreign country. And it sounds absurd and it sounds wasteful. And you think, why would somebody do that? But what the public is not recognizing is that there are more sinister motives that drive this type of activity. So a lot of the work that Mike Benz has done has really been to figure out what these motives are and what these methods are. And so I think what he's hinting at is that it's not that he has some sort of secret knowledge that is yet to be revealed, but that the general public is not interpreting the data that Elon Musk has unveiled from USAID's activity properly. They haven't fully understood the context of what they are seeing. And when they do, they're going to be horrified. But I want to let Joe and Mike actually tell you what the evidence is and how you should think about it. So let's keep watching.
When American statecraft, to manage the American empire for the benefit of the American people, began to warp and distort every institution in American life, from the media to now the social media companies, to the unions, to the universities and academics, to the NGOs and think tanks, to the prosecutors, to our conception of terrorism, to our conception of activity in the drug trade, to our what we're really doing with public health programs and the medical establishment and what drives that, all the way into poverty relief and you name it. I mean, every institution is instrumentalized by this apparatus, supposedly to help us. But really, this has been done in U.S. history before. This happened against the left, against the Democrats in the 1960s and 70s, when the CIA and to an extent its sister orgs like USAID and whatnot were pumping money into domestic politics to stop the anti-Vietnam War movement. And this led to the reforms of the late 1970s, the Church Committee hearing, the Pike Committee hearing, the establishment of a Senate Intelligence Committee and House Intelligence Committee for oversight. But even that was a very small glimpse into the window. The analogy I give here is like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the chronicles of...
Before we get into that, I want to just add a little bit of context here, that for those who don't know, like basically intelligence agencies are tasked with managing intelligence, meaning collecting data, spying, espionage, as well as putting out disinformation and kind of like messing with other people's intelligence. So it's offensive and defensive. You are putting out disinformation, you are tricking people, you're manipulating people, and you're also trying to gather information and understand things better. That's what intelligence agencies do. Now, it's really important that intelligence agencies do not act on domestically. Now, you can act, for example, you can do operations against spies inside of the United States, but these spies that you are working against are foreign spies. So the point of an intelligence agency is to go after foreign actors and use and gather intelligence on foreign actors. It's not meant to be done at home to American citizens. And so there have been scandals in the past where intelligence agencies have done operations against U.S. persons. And this has been, he was referencing these times in the past where this has come to light and there have been reforms. But as you'll see, even after these reforms, there is plenty of stuff that's still going on, and arguably it's a lot worse than ever before. And I would say probably the reason that it has gotten so bad is because in the past we did clamp down on some of this and end some of this corruption in the intelligence agencies, but we didn't fully stamp it out. And if you think about, for example, let's say you have an infection and this infection is really bad. What you do is you would take an antibiotic medication. But if you don't fully run the full course of antibiotics, what you're going to do is you're going to shrink the infection, but you're not going to eliminate it. And that remaining infection is going to actually be stronger than the original. It may actually develop an antibiotic resistance and it will be harder to kill. And it can grow bigger than ever before. So this is the type of thing where if there's a systemic problem, and you don't solve it, sometimes it will come back and become even worse and harder to defeat than before. And I think that's where we are. But let's keep listening to what they have to say.
Narnia, where there's this whole cinematic universe. You're living in this house, and there's this closet in the back of of a wardrobe, and if you never walk through it, you never see that whole world. You can live your whole life without seeing it. But when you open that door and you step into it, you see there's an entire other universe here that's been right next to you this whole time.
When you first started working for the State Department, did you have any inclination that you were going to get involved? Did you have any inclination that this was going on? Like, did you know already?
Yeah,
that
definitely.
You already knew.
Yeah, definitely. I had already been working on this for many years.
When did you first discover it?
Around August 2016, I was deeply passionate about the internet censorship issue, and you know, I had some weird experiences playing chess as a kid, where I sort of came of age when Garry Kasparov lost to Deep Blue, and AI took over. Really took the spirit out of a lot of the chess world. And it was apparent to me as a kid that these AI chess engines were going to outcompete humans. But when I was young, the sort of older people in the room were in denial about it. And when I saw that same thing in 2016 with the development of AI censorship super weapons, I call those weapons of mass deletion, that they would be like weapons of mass destruction, but for speech. A few lines of code would allow you to destroy entire political movements, governments, narratives. There'd be no escape from it. It would permanently change the face of political warfare or domestic politics. You don't need a standing army of 100,000 censors if you just have one, machine learning, just ingested database, of 900 million tweets that you can ingest and then make this sophisticated narrative network map of all the different keywords and concepts you want to censor. And to me, that was like this free speech version, or the censorship version of the atom bomb. So I started that quest in 2016, but very quickly that research and the process of trying to write that showed these international networks immediately. I mean, the NLP, the natural language processing sort of backbone of this was all being sponsored by DARPA. And to be able to monitor the speech of ISIS or extremist or terrorist groups. And when I saw that coming home and being advocated here, I spent my whole day, morning, noon, night, 20 hours a day, basically, chronicling, archiving. That's how I know so many of these characters, is because I feel like I know them better than my own friends and family, having spent so many years watching this all, develop.
What did it feel?
One thing I will say is that he is leaving out a little bit about his personal history, and this is rather controversial, and it's very interesting. But actually, so Mike Benz first came onto the scene as an anonymous alt-right personality, and his name was Frame Game. And he had this this channel called Frame Game Radio. And I remember back then, I was very involved in libertarian politics. So back in 2012, Ron Paul ran for president. And before that, he had run once before in 2008. But I got really active in libertarianism after getting inspired in 2012. And I was very online, and I was basically in these right-wing circles with a lot of libertarians. And I thought it was really interesting once Donald Trump started gaining in popularity in 2016. I saw a lot of the Ron Paul people, a lot of libertarians, start to take a different turn on the right wing. And a lot of them went to what was called the alt-right. Now, that term is not very popular anymore. It's typically associated with like white supremacy, white nationalism, anti-Semitism, and these types of beliefs. And I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But that is essentially where I saw a lot of my peers who I thought we were on the same page with go. And so like I still do not agree, for example, with most people on the right about immigration. I am much more pro-immigration than the average right-winger. And I do consider myself to be conservative. I don't consider myself to be libertarian anymore, and I do consider myself to be inside of the Trump coalition. I am a Trump supporter, but I don't fully agree with this sect. But what was so interesting, that like just seeing my friends who I thought we were completely aligned, I saw them leave libertarianism, and this was not something that I agreed with at the time. And I saw them gravitate in many cases towards basically the quote unquote alt-right. And like, so one example of a person who'd made this journey, not a personal friend of mine, but someone who I had watched for a long time, was this guy named Stefan Molyneux. And he used to make, I mean, he still, I think, does make libertarian content, but he started doing a lot more stuff about race and culture and those types of alt-right issues. So anyway, at that time, I was interested in seeing what is the appeal of this alt-right perspective. And who I came across was none other than Mike Benz under his pseudonym Frame Game. And he did a series of live streams that were very interesting. I remember thinking that he really understood the dynamics of certain aspects of our society. And it's particularly, he exposed how networks of nonprofits were able to basically launder people's reputation, extort people via lawsuits, and manipulate the narrative in the media. And he, and there was other things in what he was talking about. He kind of talked about like what's called like the Jewish question, and like the influence of basically Jews in American society. Now, he is Jewish himself, and he actually did admit this, although nobody knew who he was. But that was really the type of stuff that was really controversial. And he also said certain things at the time about black people, which I really don't agree with. But the point is, though, is he was a very interesting figure. And I always thought he had a very deep understanding. Now, what happened, though, is someone figured out who he was. And so he shut down his channel, so to speak. And eventually all of this leaked. And you can like look it up. And he basically said that the reason why he did this was he was trying to appeal to people who he perceived were anti-Semitic, and he was trying to basically, as a Jewish person, put a narrative that could basically align Jewish people with the alt-right. And he frames it as if it was an experiment in combating anti-Semitism, basically a de-radicalization effort. Now, I think if you are, I could understand how I think that makes me a bit skeptical of him. The fact that he kind of had like this, like a plan for manipulating people to some extent, or maybe he's kind of trying to dress up his historical, what he did online. Maybe he's trying to present it in a way that's more palatable. I don't know. It should cause maybe a little bit of skepticism of him. But all of that is to say that he has always been a very smart person who's very keenly aware of what is going on, and he has the receipts. So when he talks, he's actually, he has his sources, and so you don't necessarily need to trust him that much. And so what's interesting, though, as he was reciting this history, I could see why he wouldn't want to go into that, but that was also in 2016. So in 2016, he was making these videos, and he got doxxed, he stopped making them, and he then at some point also made these observations about censorship and kind of moved in that direction. But I think there's a little bit more to the story there that he didn't mention. With that said, though, I learned a lot from watching his videos. Even if I don't agree with everything he said, and maybe he doesn't agree with everything he said, or maybe it was just like, again, a frame game, like he was trying to frame things in a way in an effort to de-radicalize people. That's possible. But everyone can, I think everyone has said political opinions that they don't necessarily stand by in the past, and we shouldn't get hung up on this. He is an expert. He knows his stuff, so we can acknowledge that. And it's a very interesting history. And there's a lot to be learned from what he said, actually. But let's keep watching, because I want to hear the current stuff, and I want to see his receipts and his evidence for what he has to say.
Like being one of the only people that was sounding the alarm for essentially 8 years. Like you get involved in 2016, and no one even, the general public, until you came on this podcast, I don't even think we're aware that this was an issue at all. But even then, things got lost so quickly in the cycle of news. Things just come and go so quickly. Until Doge started unraveling all the spending.
Right.
And you start seeing things like $200 million allocated to transgender experiments on monkeys.
Right.
You're like, what the fuck? Like, this is crazy. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. And then the NGOs, and then that map of 50,000 NGOs that was essentially just Democratic propaganda machine that was exposed, that was all just money being funneled in a circular manner.
This episode is brought to you by Squareform. You can
I'm just skipping through the ad.
pay.
Totally. I mean, it's been exhilarating. There's a sort of I understand the weight of history here. We are doing open heart surgery on the body of the American empire, our influence abroad, and it has to be done well. And so, I want to help the American homeland, and so this is a sensitive process. But obviously, it's been a bit surreal seeing the past couple weeks where people are now. I go to my X timeline and I see everyone doing the same exercise that I gave up everything to be doing 8 years ago, going into, because all this stuff is open source. You didn't need to be an inside guy to see this if you knew where to look. These are usaspending.gov. I used to joke is the main difference between, or was, I think, until freedom opened up when Elon acquired X and a few institutional changes began to happen, in the government and with Congress. But, I used to joke that usaspending.gov was the main difference during the height of this censorship, total control era, was the main difference between us and Russia and China, which was that we have this sort of autocratic control over information and institutions by the U.S. government. So do they. The difference is we can go to usaspending.gov and look up how they do it. So when I've been going to my
And I think that's a very good thing. And I think this is also a really good reason why blockchain technology could play a great role in governance in the future. The more stuff that is publicly available and auditable, the more transparency, the better ability we will have to reform the system. So usaspending.gov is good, but I think there's even further layers that we can provide that can make this stuff verifiable and traceable, and that can ensure that we are able to exercise oversight over agencies and rein in waste, fraud, and abuse and corruption. And there's also the cool thing about blockchain, that using that in the government, is there's ways of still preserving privacy for certain information, stuff that we couldn't put on usaspending.gov. And what we could do is we can actually still verify certain aspects of how those systems work without revealing anything that's sensitive. And so there's a possibility to simultaneously make things so much more open, trustworthy, and transparent than the current system on usaspending.gov, which is still in some ways opaque and hard to read and analyze, while simultaneously preserving and even perhaps increasing security and privacy for sensitive topics. And if this is done right, this would be such a powerful tool for keeping the US government on the right track for years to come.
timeline and seeing everybody independently doing that exercise and finding the joy in that, the self-discovery process, and being able to share it with people and everybody being able to understand and make sense of the receipts because, this framework for understanding it has been shared and popularized. That to me has been the goal all along, to be able to give people the language and the frameworks to understand what is so terrifying and necessary to reform, but that's right there, in front of your eyes if you only open your eyes to see it.
It's got to be exciting, though, for you to be there on Operation Day when they are doing the open heart surgery.
It is. We need to make sure that the patient doesn't die, on the operating table.
Right.
Just because it's the right move to do the open heart surgery because the patient needs it, doesn't mean that the operation goes well if the operating surgeons don't know the anatomy of the organ they're operating on. And so that I see right now as sort of my prime function, is to just teach more and more of the anatomy of the organ so that the people who are operating on the patient, the American homeland, and generally speaking, the American influence and power projection into foreign countries comes out better, smarter, a little bit more honest, and there is a hard domestic firewall against our foreign-facing dirty tricks, criminal penalties against agencies who go against this, civil penalties so that you can sue both the agencies and the NGOs who are sponsored, maybe with treble damages in a bill from Congress, so that if U.S. aid, in whatever form it continues to take, whether that's at the State Department or whether it gets rolled back out into another independent agency, that you could sue the agencies as an individual if you've if they've broken that domestic firewall, so that there's an incentive at the agency on their own budget to tightly oversee these things. There's so much that can be done to bring this in line in a smarter and more moral and frankly more effective way, and that's the task right now.
I think that was a really great suggestion. I mean, of course, you have to be careful. We don't want people to somehow be able to abuse the system by opening frivolous lawsuits against the government, getting huge payouts, and basically milking that as a way of almost like getting a subsidy or welfare. But it does make sense. There's so many protections that government agents have when they're taking official actions. And I think that this is a bit of an overreach, because there are times where government officials act against individuals in a way that is simply inappropriate. And too much of it is classified as their legitimate discretion. And like, for example, the thing I don't like is when there's like certain people with a political ideology, so they say, let's go after this group and investigate them, and like we don't like crypto, so let's investigate crypto. Like, that's not how people should operate. That's more of like the Department of Justice and a different wing. That is not part of the intelligence community. But either way, the idea that, like, for example, if they do a domestic disinformation campaign, then they are now liable for damages that causes, including if they, for example, libel you. Perhaps you should be able to sue the CIA or the individual agents at the CIA that partook in that activity. And the thing is like, the question is, how do you get oversight over these agencies that have the ability to classify information and also have the ability to basically remain in power, and have, like, there's like a large group of bureaucrats that have no term limits on their employment, and they are able to be like a permanent establishment that basically can bully Congress people. And the dynamics of how voting works, it's really easy to extort people into voting your way, because essentially you have many shots on goal. There's lots of combinations of people that you could extort to convince them to tip the scales of the vote. And as a result, no one person has that leverage where they can just vote no and decide to basically fight against corruption. So if you're a corrupt actor and you're trying to extort members of Congress in order to not be subject to oversight, basically you can threaten all of them. And then the ones that resist, if they're not in the majority, if the vote doesn't go through, then you can actually target those people. And since the vote would have relieved you from having to deal with the oversight, you're actually going to be able to go through with your promise of your extortion as you had presented it to them. And so what that does is, if you're a congressperson and you're considering holding these agencies to account, and they have threatened you and they said they're going to go after you, what you're actually incentivized to just vote to preserve them, because then they won't go after you, because someone else might make that calculus, and if they decide that was their choice and then the vote goes through, then you're screwed. So it's a very difficult for Congress to hold bureaucrats to account. I'm not saying that this is what's happening. I'm saying it's a theoretical reason why Congress fundamentally has a hard time regulating these agencies. And in practice, we have examples of how basically they have little to no ability to affect change in these agencies long term. So but that is for Congress, where there's a relatively small group of people who are voting. And if we open this up to the general public, you can't play those types of games. The scale is just too big. So if you go after a well-resourced person who would be basically a very prime target for intelligence agencies, if they go after a domestic person, that domestic person will now have resources and an ability to pursue recourse. And so now it's a lot more dangerous for them to pursue domestic persons. And if they go after a large group of people, then now there's going to be so many people they can't really, like, for example, bribe or blackmail or extort people out of taking action, because somebody in that group is going to want to take action against them. So there is, it's a complicated thing. You want to get it right, but the potential for actually allowing the general public to take action when federal employees wrong them, I think is a really great idea.
One of the most offensive things to Americans is that all this was being done and all this money was being spent while they were denying money to people that clearly needed it. Mm-hmm. Like particularly victims of natural disasters like Maui. Right. The fact that they're spending all this money on those things, and yet they gave those people a one-time check of $770 or something along those lines.
Right. Well, this gets to the fundamental heart of the breach of the social contract that this thing was always set up to do. You know, it was really set up in 1948 when George Kennan created this NSC 10-2, this National Security Council. We completely reoriented the structure of the American empire in 1948 after World War II. In 1947, we passed something called the National Security Act. That's what established the CIA. That's what established the National Security Council, which coordinates all of our, foreign-facing empire management work. It renamed the Department of War to the Department of Defense so that it didn't look like we were, acquiring territory by military force, which had just been banned under international law, under the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And so we moved from primarily kinetic warfare into what George Kennan called, just 2 months before he created the plausible deniability doctrine that we live under, he called this organized political warfare. And he has a great memo from April 30th, 1948. It's just 12 days after the CIA's first operation, first time it ever overthrew or rigged the election of a foreign government. This was the April 1948 election in Italy that pitted a pro-Western candidate against a sort of pro-Soviet candidate. And so the U.S. State Department felt it was essential to tip the scales of that election because it showed that the pro-Soviet candidate was winning 60-40. This is all declassified, and all the major people who were involved in that operation have all come out and said this publicly. So this, the CIA, basically we threw together this ramshackle effort to tilt that election by pumping in propaganda, by using charities and churches as fronts to funnel money into the pro-Western political party. We piped in, the Greg Garbo movies and whatnot. We worked with some very very seedy elements of Italian society there. We worked with the mafia, and we worked with mafia-connected unions because these were all assets for the War Department during World War II because Mussolini was cracking down on them. So the War Department had a relationship with these organized criminal networks to serve as a beachhead against Mussolini. But we kept those relationships in order to run this pro-democracy regime change thing. So in 1948, when we established the secrecy doctrine that we now live under, and all these NGOs work under this cover effectively, because of their sponsoring organizations, USAID or CIA or state. And he called it the inauguration of organized political warfare. And what he said is, we need to create a covert apparatus to hide what we do from the rest of the world, to do secret political warfare on the low. And the problem is the American people are not going to like this. The American people do not understand the intricacies of international relations. They think there's always an easy political cure-all, and they do not understand. They think there's a fundamental difference between peace and war. And what he proposed is.
So there's two things about this I find very interesting. First of all, so this certainly seems to have been effective. This doctrine of plausible deniability and secrecy, it seems to have been very effective at the time when it was originally implemented, and that is what you would expect. Imagine you're a very well-respected individual, very trusted member of the community, and people are going to trust you. People are going to really take your word for things whenever, you say something. Now, imagine that you say, I'm going to go over to someone's house and I'm going to help them. Like if you announce that, nobody, that you're a trusted member of the community, nobody would expect anything of you. And then let's say you go in their house and you pretend to help them, but you steal something. Okay, now you've started to actually do actions that eventually will break trust if they're continued. But at the moment, it seems as if you just got free things. And so you stole something and now you like this and you say, this worked really well. This is a great way to get money. So now whenever you go over to someone's house or you go wherever you go or do whatever you do, now you start cheating people. At first, you're going to get very good results and you're basically selling your reputation in order to engage in this in this activity. And it seems like it's working. It seems like it's in a very effective way of governing. But in reality, you're actually setting yourself up to be mistrusted in the long term. And the reputation that you painstakingly built as a pillar of the community is getting destroyed. So this is something that, if with a very short-term mindset, works. But in reality, you simply need to do a lot more things above board. You need to, the United States should conduct itself in a moral, transparent, and ethical way. That is the way forward. That is not only the values of the American people, but it's actually the most practical strategy. If we can legitimately be the biggest military and economic power, we don't need to worry about foreign threats because we will be able to beat them outright. You don't need to have a lot of secrets to win if you're actually better. So that's how I like to think about this. Let's keep listening to what he's saying.
And this is just 2 months before this would formally be given to the CIA to do. But at the time, what he said was, this worked gangbusters in Italy. We need to replicate this everywhere. We need to create a capacity to do black propaganda, to do economic sabotage, demolition. There's a whole list of what's authorized under NSC 10-2. And what he says is, the American people are not necessarily going to like this, and we're going to need to effectively hide what we do from them, because if they find out, then the rest of the world finds out. If we're trying to run an operation in Eurasia, and we report this in U.S. News, well, then any person in Eurasia who reads U.S. News now knows about it.
Exactly.
And so that was authorized at the time with simultaneous with the Smith-Mundt Act, which are you familiar with the Smith-Mundt Act?
Is that the 2011, 2012 thing where Obama allowed people to use propaganda against United States citizens?
Yeah, that was what was done then under Obama was the effective repeal of it. It was called the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act.
Okay.
But the modernization got rid of the whole purpose of it, the firewall, because at the time the media and media control was seen as the linchpin crux of winning the Cold War, piping in pro-U.S. Media influence because everything moved after World War II from kinetic warfare and military occupation. We used to militarily occupy the Philippines, for example, after we won the Spanish-American War, but that was banned under international law. Territorial acquisition by military force in 1948. So we had to win elections, and we had to influence the passage of laws in foreign countries by having an apparatus inside those countries that influenced the hearts and minds of people, which influenced who they voted for, which then determined the government. So you had to move towards political vassalage rather than military occupation. And what the Smith-Mundt Act did is, simultaneous with the creation of this in 1948, Congress recognized the Frankensteinian monster they were creating by authorizing a covert, permanent Department of Dirty Tricks, and this is their phrase, not mine, to do this cloak and dagger, to infiltrate and co-opt the universities, the unions, the media, the politicians, the judges, the whole swarm army. What I have been calling for a long time the USA Truman Show, because it's, these people in these foreign countries have no idea, how many of the things they interact with that are effectively a movie set being constructed by the U.S. State Department and its sister influence orgs. But the point that I'm getting at here is the Smith-Mundt Act in 1948 said, okay, you guys can do this. State Department can do this. CIA can do this. USAID, when it came along 13 years later, could do this. But so there was a guy named Frank Wisner, who was known as one of the godfather figures of the CIA. He's known for creating what was called the Wisner's Wurlitzer, which was it's like a church organ. and that he would brag that he could play the international media like a symphony to make any media narrative go viral in any country on earth because of the suite of CIA proprietary media functions and its distribution network, especially when the U.S. had first mover advantage in radio and print. It's basically the U.S. and U.K. were the only games in town, really, in having robust radio, film, TV, and print media. So the Smith said, okay, you can do that abroad. You can plant fake news stories in France. You can, have propaganda blare into Africa or Western Europe or Central Asia, but that can't come home. You can't psyop our own people with your propaganda organ abroad, because the whole point of authorizing this is that we get cheaper gas, we get import-export markets, we get a high standard of living, because if a foreign government doesn't want to give up its resources or allow a U.S. military base or allow joint partnerships or exports of goods or U.S. multinational corporations to operate there, then the American people suffer economically. So it was always designed to say, listen, you can do this dirty stuff abroad, but it can't come home. And even that protection, which lasted for 70 years, and we only lost it a decade ago. We're up against a much actually deeper, darker problem with this USAID scandal.
So he's saying that we lost this protection. They actually now can do disinformation at home. I mean, this is really bad. What I think we should be doing is instead of trying to trick people and lose our credibility and engage in these deceptive practices to better our own domestic industries, what we should do is we should be advocating for technologies that genuinely facilitate communication and truth. We should be getting more people online, getting more people on the internet which we are doing, but we're doing that as a vehicle to deliver them CNN.com and to get them to use our social networks, which we are forcing to censor things in a certain way in accordance with our beliefs. We should just purely try to get people to use honest technology that facilitates communication. This will topple regimes that are oppressive and that are based on a big bunch of lies, and it reinforce the interests of nations that are actually doing things the right way. Because if you're not doing anything wrong, you really don't have anything to hide. And what's interesting is that it's possible to build technology in a way that enshrines American values. So like, for example, like cryptocurrency is a great example of a technology that is built in a way that is very much in line with U.S. values. It values like personal rights, privacy, property rights, and it is very much against totalitarian control and the ability for a single organization to manipulate and basically abuse their power as the controlling force that drives this technology. So decentralized blockchain-based technology is a great thing that the U.S. should be promoting abroad. And in doing so, I think it'll achieve 99% of the objectives that USAID is trying to do when they do these foreign disinformation campaigns. Now, it may be slightly less effective, but in the long run, it's not going to degrade our credibility, which is what's happening. And these deceptive tactics that the intelligence agencies and USAID are doing right now, it may get us some results, but over time, we're seeing those results diminish. And eventually, we're just going to be the boy who cried wolf. We just keep putting out these narratives, and people affiliated with us keep saying these narratives, and nobody trusts them. Now, just look at how much trust in the mainstream media has degraded, especially domestically, especially as these protections against the putting domestic narratives have been removed. You see how quickly this degrades trust. This is something that works in the moment, and that's why when they started it, they decided to continue it back in the 60s. But it clearly, like, we can see how much these institutions have fallen, how much the mainstream media and traditional institutions that are under the control of U.S. intelligence, we see how much they are fallen in the domestic eyes as soon as they started being weaponized against the American people. This is also happening abroad. So, like, you might think like, look, I'm in favor of America doing well. I want the U.S. to get cheap oil and cheap goods because I live in the U.S., so I want to benefit from that. But I also want to be realistic and realize that this is a cheap trick. It's not a strategy. It's not a long-term strategy. It will not only not work in the long run, it will backfire and it will create resentment as it already is and has done. So we're better off just getting things in line, doing things above board and thinking, what is the right thing to do? Let's act as ethical people. And when you're in doubt about how to affect change in the world, I think that's the best idea. Just fall back on being moral, being ethical, and doing the right thing. Let's keep listening.
And as people will see increasingly, the scandals that will break open at the Pentagon and the State Department, which is that we have a Smith-Mundt problem for funding and operations. It's not just propaganda. The blob, our foreign policy establishment, can fund groups that effectively work with prosecutors domestically, or
That's really bad.
or that work at media. Dual use. We give them foreign grants to do media propaganda abroad, but they operate here. Or social media censorship, to coerce foreign countries to pass foreign censorship laws that explicitly and are intended to attack U.S. social media companies and in U.S. peer-to-peer speech. So we need that protection. If we're going to keep this function at all, we need a hard firewall and absolute grotesque penalties for any violation.
I agree. And one thing, I think the worst thing that they do, and I don't like social media censorship, but on some level, I'm a little bit okay with it. And the reason is because there's a lot of competition online. And as one platform gets worse, another one can pop up. And it is actually quite possible to displace incumbents in the tech industry. And there's decentralized protocols that are on the rise. There's all these other alternatives. So I don't like tech censorship, but on some level, it's less alarming to me, although it's a big deal. But what's really, really sinister and evil is the weaponization of prosecutorial discretion. So when the intelligence community comes and works in concert with the Department of Justice, FBI, law enforcement, you name it, when they are actually doing joint operations and launching investigations and prosecuting U.S. persons, that is the worst possible outcome that this system can produce. And we absolutely need to end that with an absolute fury, because the reason is that when people domestically want to reform the system and want to exercise oversight, now they have a weapon that they can use to threaten people and force them to back off whenever they're trying to investigate them. So like Senator Joni Ernst from Delaware was, for example, trying to exercise congressional oversight over U.S. aid. U.S. aid threatened her, and they wouldn't even comply with what she wanted. They lied to her. They misled her. They made her jump through a bunch of hoops. They literally undercut her at every single point and pushed back very intensely on anything that she tried to do. She basically had no ability to do any sort of reform. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. That's just the things that we know about. There's lots of other examples of politicians getting blackmailed and entangled into these messy intelligence operations. This is really bad. We cannot let them do that type of thing domestically. At the end of the day, we have to be able to correct the things that are wrong in our system. That is the most important capability that we must maintain. Let's keep watching.
So when you're watching all this unfold, one of the things that I've been seeing is that there's been legal action to try to halt some of it. They've been told to destroy any information that they got from certain databases. Like, what's your take on this, and whether any of that is going to hold up?
Oh, 100%. 100. I don't know if it's going to hold up. I think it's going to be a legal dogfight. This is, it's funny because it's sort of a circular dragon eating its own tail, because you're going after the primary soft power projection organ of the blob, because it's been weaponized against Americans. But what is the blob authorized to do? What is U.S. aid authorized to do under statute? Well, something they call judicial reform, which is U.S. aid poaching, funding financially the networks around judges, around courts, around the legal system, around the governance structure of every country on planet Earth. I mean, and Jamie, if you want to just go through a fun exercise right now, you can even put on screen just a simple Google search so people can see just how open source this is. And I can walk through specific damning examples of this. But if you just type in on Google the word USAID and then in a Boolean quotes, judicial reform, and what you're going to see are, basically 100 countries that USAID is going after the judges, going after the legal system in order to rig the scales of justice in favor of the foreign policy establishment's interests there. And this has fully come home. And I can
Wow.
go through some examples of this. For example, there's
So to be clear about what he's saying is that USAID and intelligence agencies have been working to exert control and influence to undermine the justice systems in other countries, including like affecting who is on the judiciary and who are the prosecutors, and basically planting people and influencing things in that way. And now he's saying that this has come home. They are also doing this not only in foreign countries, but they are doing this domestically. And their goal is to, quote unquote, advocate for the foreign interest of, or the interests of America. And what this means is the interests of the foreign policy establishment, meaning the deep state actors and the corporations that work in concert with them. And so in doing the implication in doing this domestically is that domestic activities, U.S. citizens, people who live in the United States, are basically undermining, like the way they're framing it is that they're undermining the interests of America. But they are America, and fundamentally what it really means is that they're actually undermining the interests of the deep state in America. And there's a conflation between the country itself and the actual government institutions and the specific individuals that work there with the actual interests of the country. Let's keep watching.
a group called the OCCRP, which is, you can think of as the Corruption Reporting Project. This is a group that half of its funding comes from USAID and the U.S. State Department. OCCRP has to the USAID and the State Department have a veto right over the staff that it can hire. This is the largest consortium of investigative journalists on planet Earth. This is the group that broke the Panama Papers, that got all these hacked documents. They got special access to it. I don't have any facts on this. I'm simply noting that it's an oddity that a group funded by a major CIA funding conduit, USAID, while the CIA has the ability to hack, any target around the world that's authorized by the National Security Council, they're getting these special access documents that are reportedly either hacked or leaked, and they're being sponsored by, the group that's connected to something with a hacking power. But I don't know that for a fact. I'm simply noting that for investigative purposes, for oversight bodies who may want to ask questions. But they've won hundreds of awards. Their name has been so pristine for so long. They've been around for almost 20 years, and they were sponsored in order to do investigative hit piece journalism about corruption. And what they do is they go after all of the State Department and USAID and DOD's opponents in the region. So, for example, Jamie, I texted you this beforehand, but if the first thing you want to put on screen are the first two images that I texted you, this is from the USAID.gov website. And I think this will shock people when they see this with the USAID.gov URL right there, and so that you can see how. Yeah. So if you go to the first page that I texted you, and then we'll get to this one.
This is the first thing you sent.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. The second one then. Yeah. Okay. So here it is. This is USAID's Strengthening Transparency and Accountability Through Investigative Reporting Program. Okay. What you'll see here is you'll see the life of activity. This fund they are still being funded through this grant. And this is for Europe and Eurasia. And you'll see the countries: Eastern Partnership, Armenia, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, and Western Balkans. If you scroll down, you'll see USAID funding is $20 million. $20 million that our taxpayers paid to listen, they don't report on, kittens being saved from falling out of trees. Everything they do is a hit piece about an instance of corruption that can be used by prosecutors in the area to arrest the political opponents of the State Department. And what you'll see here is capacity. Now, this is the phrase everybody has to know. Capacity building is what this is all built under. That means pumping up the blob's assets. Whenever you see the word capacity or capacity building, it means this thing is useful to us. The more money we give it, the more powerful they are to project our influence. And so if you go back to that page, which is page 2 of this USAID, you think, here's what you see. So for $20 million of investment from USAID, here are and this is live on the website. You can find this in the Wayback Machine right now because the USAID website's down. This is USAID, the U.S. government, bragging about the achievements of what they achieved by spending $20 million. At least $4.5 billion in fines levied against targets of these hit pieces. Now, by the way, I should note that the head of the OCCRP was busted in a major documentary that has very little distribution, but I encourage everyone to watch, where he said, because this was I think a year and a half ago or whatnot, but they're up to over $10 billion now.
What's the documentary?
It's on the WikiLeaks X page right now. It's by a group of German journalists who had one-on-one interviews with the head of this group, OCCRP, as well as the USAID grant coordinator and others. And so it's straight from the horse's mouth. And he says in that interview, I believe his name is Drew Sullivan, that it's now over $10 billion. And he brags that is I think he said it was a 20,000% return on investment because all these dollars were, quote, returned to government coffers. So for $20 million of mercenary media for the state-sponsored hit pieces, the government's got $10 billion back. That's pretty good. That's a 1995 Amazon level return on investment. But now let's get into the darker stuff. 548 policy changes by the government or actions by civil society and the private sector. Now, we don't know if these policy changes are good or bad. Do you think USAID would list them as accomplishments if they were not in furtherance of USAID's or the State Department's foreign policy goals in the region? What they are saying and trying to sort of speak through their teeth, as they say it, is that they proudly sponsored hit piece journalism to ruin people's lives and go after political targets in order to change the policies of foreign governments from the inside. Now, it goes on to say 21 resignations and sackings, including of a president and prime minister. Now, the head of OCCRP in this documentary openly says that...
Okay, I want to add a little bit of context here, or just like a way of thinking about this. I think this is a really important point. And this is something that Balaji Srinivasan talks about. And I reference him a lot as one of the best tech thought leaders out there and a prolific predictor of future events. He has been very prescient. And when he talks, a lot of people think this is crazy, this makes no sense. But then you always end up seeing how he was on to something way before. And so one of the things that he talks about is the stochastic nature of journalism, of journalistic hit pieces. And basically the idea is that a journalist comes and makes a hit piece against somebody, and it may or may not stick. But the thing is that there's thousands of journalists out there, and they're doing hit pieces on a bunch of different people. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It's stochastic, meaning it's random. And what it does, though, is if you apply this force, a bunch of journalists basically investigating, putting out narratives and hit pieces, you're going to exert a lot of pressure on anyone that this apparatus is targeted at. And so what's really sinister about this is that if the government is actually directing journalists to do hit pieces, in a sense, this is like having a debate without actually having a debate in politics. So imagine there's two candidates. One, that they were like debating over policy. What should the policy be? Now, maybe both candidates have flaws. Everyone has flaws. So maybe there's one that has flaws, but they have a good point. And so if in a fair contest, when two politicians are now on stage debating the issues and someone says, well, you were corrupt, you did this, you did that, this was bad, they can hash it out. maybe they say, oh, your marriage failed. And they said, oh, well, you cheated on your wife or whatever, right? They can pull up dirt on each other. And you realize that it's two people, both of whom have flaws. And you are now choosing basically the better of two evils, essentially. That's how you think of it as a voter. You don't expect people to be perfect. But what happens is that journalists are in a very different position. Journalists are able to launch these investigations, and it's not the journalist as a person versus the politician as a person. The journalist is like just basically, it doesn't matter who they are. It doesn't speak, like the fact they're going after them, nobody connects the dots that this is actually an attack by a specific opponent in the political scene. Instead, it's just, oh, well, that journalist just wrote this. It's just, who cares who that is? That's not an important person. And they do this, and they take many different attempts under the guise of many independent researchers and journalists that are supposedly acting not in concert. But if you are able to actually coordinate across journalists and have targeted attacks towards people, you're going to basically do a lot of damage, because this is not going to be perceived as a political attack from an opponent where you have to weigh the two options. You just see a lot of things that are seemingly for no reason coming out bad about this other person. If this was a campaign ad, it would not be as effective. But that's not how people see it. People see it as independent research. And well, if it was there, people must have stumbled upon it and published it. There must be a lot of evidence for it. No, actually, there was a lot of people who were paid by the government to do hit pieces and to basically push a narrative. And it seems organic, but it's actually not. And it's a super effective way of attacking people in an obfuscated manner where it can't be traced, and people perceive it as more credible than an attack by a political opponent. And the problem with the government itself doing this, and the deep state employees in the government doing this, is that they themselves are subject to political oversight from Congress. And if they can then go and use this type of apparatus against Congress people, they can actually influence who is in charge of them. So in a sense, they are in charge of their own boss, or they're able to shape the events that decide who is their boss. And that basically makes it very hard to reform this system. So as I've been saying many times, we should be very thankful that Elon is really going in there and going after this system, because it takes a lot of bravery. You better believe they're investigating him. They're doing every hit piece they can. They're doing all the spin that they can against him. And they've been doing it for a long time. And so most people are scared of that. But I think it's really cool that he's even willing to go up against these people.
That their reporting caused, I think it was 5 or 6 different governments to topple and turn over and be transitioned. Proudly. So this is state-sponsored media hit pieces so that prosecutors can arrest presidents and prime ministers to regime change their government and install a more pro-U.S. Political vassal figure in the region. And then the last one is 456 arrests and indictments. And this, again, is listed as a USAID achievement. We don't know what these people did. We don't know, whether they're guilty or innocent, or whether or not these were political prosecutions, like you see right now with the New York District Attorney's offices, which is a whole nother USAID-connected can of worms. But these are state-sponsored hit pieces for hire in order to give the justice departments, the prosecutors in a region, the ammunition to arrest the enemies of the state. The prosecutors don't have the capacity to do a whole investigative journalism dig. They might not have access to hacked documents that, for example, the CIA, the NSA, or deeply connected political insiders might be able to give to a group like OCCRP. Now, USAID gets a veto right over who they can hire. OCCRP has to submit an annual work plan to be submitted to and reviewed for approval by the State Department and USAID. And here's the kicker of it all. OCCRP, paid for by us, U.S. taxpayers, dug up dirt on Rudy Giuliani's work in Ukraine. This is because, this was part of the 2019 impeachment and, Rudy Giuliani and his work in Ukraine. So they went and dug up dirt on Rudy Giuliani, a domestic U.S. citizen and high-profile political figure, actually attorney
that's
to
totally
the U.S. president.
This is literally government funding investigative journalists that are now going after people in the United States that are the opponents of those that had decided to give them the funding. And yes, you could say, oh, well, they're independent, so they don't control that. But that is actually the lie. They are not independent. They know where they're paycheck is coming from. And this is just how it works. And even if you, like, the whole point of this is plausible deniability. So there is doubt that can be injected into this. But I mean, first of all, look at how they're bragging about the accomplishments and what they've delivered for U.S. aid. You know that this is how they're thinking of it. And second of all, if you haven't been in this situation yourself, you may not fully understand the types of forces that are at work when you get funded by someone. I'll tell you a little bit of a story. So I'm an entrepreneur. I raised venture-backed funding for my tech company. And I used to have a business model where I would go to other companies and they would pay me a subscription type thing, like a very large enterprise subscription for some software related products and services. And so when I was doing that actively, I really felt constrained, and I was in the cryptocurrency industry, which is kind of like a shady industry. And the people I worked with were good people, but there was a lot that I could criticize because of like industry practices, marketing techniques that people did. There's a lot of things that if I spoke my mind, I could have said, but I knew where my paycheck was coming from. And it was a bit difficult to navigate that. Like I was worried about the things that I would say and how that would affect those that funded me. And even though nobody said anything, it was an implicit just, it's something that you adopt when you take money. You implicitly start acting a certain way, and you don't want, especially the customers. I wouldn't want to ever anger the customers. So even if there's not an explicit contract, when people are getting lots of money and orienting their whole organization around these types of achievements and how they're able to deliver value to these government departments, they are going to be acting in their interest. And if you don't believe that, you're just very naive and you don't know how these systems actually work. And
then that dirt came home and was used as part of the basis for the 2019 impeachment of the sitting president, Donald Trump. That would have...
Hey, Ethan, thanks for the chat. True. Yeah, once you leave, right now we got one viewer live, but we've had other people tuning in. So no worries.
Never happened unless USAID sponsored.
Also, people will then come and search this and they will watch it later. But thank you so much for watching.
That hit piece work. And then they did the same thing with Paul Manafort, because it's the same foreign policy blob that went after Trump in the first place because of his difference in foreign policy vision around Ukraine, Russia, and other major.
This episode is brought to someone's
Skipping the
time.
commercials.
Think of find someone just aim and things to work through still really problem. Try something since every connect help this month. RE.
Case that he lost against Giuliani is interesting. Like, what is the case that he lost? It was in Georgia, and he was accusing these women who worked at this election facility of some improprietary.
Right. This is a different case than that because this was related to the 2019 impeachment and all the Ukraine kerfuffle around the quid pro quo call allegedly that President Trump made to President Zelensky, which, by the way, we should get to USAID's role in the Joe Biden quid pro quo side of this in a second.
I'm very interested in that.
That case, I believe, related to two workers in Georgia, and it was related.
One thing I want to say is that actually this is what got me to support Trump, was specifically the impeachment proceedings. I was not ever really a fan of Trump. I think I really didn't like Hillary back in 2016 when he ran. So I was marginally against Hillary, but I was not pro-Trump. I didn't even vote in that election, and I was like pleasantly surprised when he won. But I was not at all a fan of anything that he was saying or doing. I wasn't I wasn't like big immigration guy. I liked free trade. He just wasn't. He wasn't to my taste, let's say. But I liked that he was not the establishment. And at the time, I also had a much more naive view of what the establishment was, as I do now. But I always was like generally sympathetic to the attacks. I thought that people exaggerated how bad he was. But I wasn't a big Trump supporter. But at some point, I just got fed up with all the attacks against him. I thought it was way over the top. And that really culminated with the impeachment proceedings. And basically there was like this phone call that he had with Zelensky, and he was asking him about if he could, investigate Hunter Biden's activity, and this leaked. And what I noticed is there was a lot of people promising that these bombshells would come out and that they had all this very damning evidence, and it never actually came out. And it turned out that they didn't actually have this evidence. And that was a huge moment at which they lost credibility. And it just almost seemed like so desperate the way that they were trying to attack Trump at that time. So I was never that is the moment really that I actually started supporting Trump. I was not a Trump supporter prior to that. And from there, just the more they attacked him, the more that I liked him. And then ultimately, though, I think that he has come closer to what my politics are. My politics have evolved, and I have politics very close to that of someone like Elon. And now you see that there is a really nice alliance forming between Elon and Trump. So let's keep watching.
To the whole investigation of election fraud, and whether or not there may have been fraud perpetrated in the in the Georgia election in, I believe it was either 2021 or it may have been the 2020. I'm not that case. I'm not deep in the weeds on, but I have to say this as well. And Jamie, I don't know if the whole audience is familiar with this clip, but it's an incredible, scandalous clip. Do you remember when Joe Biden was at the Council on Foreign Relations and bragged that he got the top prosecutor in Ukraine fired by the Ukrainian government because he explicitly conditioned the firing of the prosecutor who was investigating Burisma. He expressly conditioned their receipt of $1 billion in U.S. financial assistance on the firing of Victor Shokin, the prosecutor. And he said, son of a b, he was fired. And
it's so crazy watching him brag about that publicly. It just shows you what an idiot he is.
You know what that $1 billion in financial assistance was? It was a USAID grant. Yeah, it's the carrots and sticks, and it's like
find that video, Jamie, because it's a shocking video. And it's just the hubris and the ego that someone has to have to speak of this publicly while it's being filmed, not just publicly, not just in a room, not even just saying it out loud, but saying it.
Well, it seemed as though at the time that U.S. aid was untouchable. And it seemed like this foreign policy establishment, there's like no one could take it down. People have tried to audit it. They push back. They threaten them. They don't comply. And there's no repercussions. But you have to realize that these things are illusions. It's not true. It's not really invincible. It just seems invincible. And don't get tricked by that. So I recommend to anyone involved in this, my personal recommendation to you is if you are finding yourself allied with USAID and these types of intelligence operations, I think your heart may be in the right place. You want these institutions to be effective and you want to advance America's interest. But you have to realize that in the end, the way that this is constructed, it's going to fail. It seems like this is the winning side. It seems like these are the most powerful forces and institutions in the world. But in fact, they're very delicate. They're built on a house of lies. And it's a shaky foundation. And although there's a temporary dominance, in the long run, it's going to blow up. And it's just a fundamental truth. And if you want to be honest about how the world works, you have to contend with that fact. It's kind of like buying insurance. You might think, I don't need insurance. Why do I need insurance? You just spend money and nothing ever happens. And maybe you haven't had like a medical accident or a car accident or a home incident or something, and you haven't thought you needed insurance. But in reality, it's just because nothing has happened to you yet. And although maybe you could live your whole life with nothing going wrong, at some point, something probably will. And you're going to wish that you had spent that extra money on the insurance. So it's the same fallacy. You can get ahead by not paying the premiums, but you're only ahead for a short time. And then the consequence of not actually taking these proactive steps to insure yourself will end up in putting you in a very bad situation, such a much worse situation than the cost of the premiums. Like the downside is immense, and the cost of just getting the insurance is very low. So the way that I want to relate this to U.S. aid is, if you think that these systems are invincible, that is an illusion. Basically, they're cutting corners. And as a result, they're getting ahead. They're getting an advantage. And that advantage is not going to last, because they're actually, these cutting corners will lead to systemic instability. And it's like not having insurance. Things can go very wrong. And even though they're currently ahead, they're currently doing well, because it's like they're not having insurance and they have this extra money. It's like equivalent to that. They're doing these shady tactics. They're getting away with it. It seems like things are going well, but when shit hits the fan, it's all going to fall apart. And people are going to point fingers, and they're going to be mad, and they're going to say, who was involved in this? And they're going to investigate it, and there's going to be trials, and there's going to be outrage. And so I would just get out while you can. That's just my personal suggestion. Don't ally yourself with this group. This is a loser.
In front of the Council of Foreign Relations backdrop.
And actually, before you play this, can I make one quick note for the audience
Sure.
that everyone can look up publicly? The Council of Foreign Relations was. I'm just about to text Jamie another thing related to this. I'm going to pull up the USAID grant so that everyone can see this $1 billion USAID grant that he's referring to here, and what's in the grant details. But when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, running the State Department that USAID answers to, right? USAID is independent but guided by the State Department, because it's a State Department function. It has to advance U.S. interests. Well, when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, Council of Foreign Relations had just opened up a D.C. office. They're New York-based. And she went over to them and she made a speech, and she said, "Thank you, Foreign Relations, for opening up your D.C. office. That way I don't need to travel all the way to New York to be told what to do." I was the head of the State Department.
She really said it like that?
Wow.
Yeah, everyone can look this up. That
so
might not be
funny.
verbatim, but it was as explicit as that, effectively. But if you want to play this,
I remember going over convincing our team, or others too, convincing us that we should be providing for loan guarantees. And I went over for, I guess, the 12th, 13th time to Kyiv, and I was supposed to announce that there was another $1 billion loan guarantee. And I had gotten a commitment from Poroshenko and from Yatsenyuk that they would take action against the state prosecutor, and they didn't. So they said they were walking out to press conference. I said, "No," I said, "I'm not going to, or we're not going to give you the $1 billion." They said, "You have no authority. You're not the president." The president said. I said, "Call him." I said, "I'm telling you, you're not getting the $1 billion." I said, "You're not getting the $1 billion. I'm going to be leaving here." And I think it was 6 hours. I said, "I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money." Well, son of a bitch, got fired, and they put in place someone who was solid.
The funny thing about this is people are saying, okay, so Elon has no authority to cancel these things, and Trump has no authority. The executives cannot cancel U.S. aid funding. Like this is something that Congress has authorized, and they can't do anything about it. Now, this is of course not true, but it's funny that that's the narrative. Now, it's very ironic that in this clip, Joe Biden is actually talking about pulling a USAID grant from Ukraine. And so that is literally what he said, call the president, he and Obama were doing. They were literally canceling USAID funding. So if the executive branch can't do that, how were they able to do this? And how is this okay? That's something that needs to be answered.
Time.
Solid.
Still, they made some genuine, substantial changes institutionally and with people.
Yeah, so there's two things to immediately follow up on that with that. So, Jamie, I just sent you two things over text here. The first one is the U.S. is that $1 billion loan guarantee, and then I sent you another one about securing commitments, and then
It's just wild that someone would be so brazen to talk about that so publicly. It's that no one's going to look at it. But someone that was solid. What was wrong with the first guy? Let's go into depth. You know, the fact that you wouldn't think, like, maybe someone's going to investigate what was the first guy looking into. Oh, why was my son running Burisma? Like, what is going on? Why is he making $10 million a year there? What is going on? What is this?
Okay.
This is
So
all
was a
juicy
billion-
and it's going to get good. But right now it's 2:00. I've got a lot to do today. So I'm going to cut it off here. And what I'm going to do is, if you like this, please leave a comment. Tell me if you want me to finish reacting to this video. I really wanted to get this initial reaction because Mike Benz is awesome. He's a wealth of knowledge. And so this is going to be a very insightful thing. I'm going to listen to the rest of this. And if I think that it is, that there's like a lot of breaking information, I'll continue making content on it. Or if you request it in the comments, I will also continue reacting to this. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to other topics tomorrow and on the further days. So if you like this video, please like it and subscribe and comment. Tell me your thoughts. If you disagree with me, comment. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Just gotta end the stream here.